Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are just getting at the top of the hour here, and so we're going to give another a minute or so for folks to get online with us here. But we're so glad those of you who were able to promptly join us are here, and look forward to getting the program started in just another minute. So I think we're getting close to a pretty good quorum. Let me give it about another 30 seconds. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Flynn. I'm the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, and thrilled to be playing the master ceremonies of sorts here for Jill Jamieson, who will be speaking to us about how we think about financing all the important work that we need to do to build more resilient infrastructure. You know, I was saying to Jill just before we all got gathered together here, this could not be more timely, given that it looks like after more than a quarter century of neglect, the nation has figured out that it may need to actually make a substantial investment in infrastructure. That being said, one of the distinguishing factors of the new infrastructure legislation is that it opens up for a lot of competitive proposals, and to agree that the federal government traditionally hasn't done as much, especially for transportation like infrastructure projects. And so this translates into a lot of municipalities, states, and others who are going to have to kind of really figure out where it is they want to go and how they make a compelling case to get access to some of those resources. And there's basically trillions of dollars, literally, in the private sector, private capital, that is struggling to find good places to invest and looking for opportunities to make those investments. But private public is something in the United States, particularly, we've not done very well. Jill has been on the cutting edge of a lot of that and can share some ideas, because at the end of the day, we're going to need all the capital we can get, and it's not all going to be publicly financed. And so we obviously going to need to figure out how we bring together the resources that are out there to take this thing on. I'm really thrilled that Jill has been willing to serve as a distinguished, let me get that out here, a distinguished senior fellow at the Global Resilience Institute. Our paths almost crossed together. We have the same alma mater as graduate students at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And that really, I had the opportunity to get to know Jill, because one of the things that we've been very much focused on at the Global Resilience Institute is how do we actually move from best practices to reality. And that means you got to figure out how to invest in those best practices. And funding and financing is core to that. And that's why we're really delighted to have Jill with us today. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jill to get us started. Please don't hesitate, for those in the audience here, to kind of start using the chat to lay out your comments and questions, so I can track those as Jill frames her opening remarks, and then I'll try to facilitate that once those are done. I know it's going to be a very informative hour ahead, and over to you, Jill, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you guys about the funding and financing resilient infrastructure. But in full disclosure, I think I left a word out of the title, and it's funding, financing, and delivery of resilience infrastructure, because it's not just about the money. It's about actually how we deliver this in a timely and cost-effective manner so that we get the outcomes we want. So for those of you joining just for funding and financing, I'm throwing in a free topic, and that is delivery. That'll be on top of that. But I think we can't divorce the two, and that might be one of the problems that we often have when we talk about this. So I want to start with the broad strokes. Look, resilience means different things to different people. You could do an entire hour on cyber resilience. You could do an entire hour on other kinds of resilience. But today I'm really going to focus mostly on climate. Not because I'm favoring that over other things, but I think that this is one of the topics that is probably front of mind. And for those of you who have been following the infrastructure bill as Steve laid out, it's mentioned over 200 times in that bill. And so we really do have some movement now in this direction. But I do want to talk about a little bit, just in a global context, in the US context. To begin with, the impacts of climate change are no longer hypothetical, right? I think that debate is now beyond us. Each year, extreme events such as hurricanes, droughts, fires, freeze events, they grow more frequent and more intense, destroying homes, disrupting businesses, and destroying the natural world along the way. So minimizing and adapting to these impacts has to be a priority for not only every unit of government, state, local, and federal, but also for every sector of the economy, whether you're the private sector, whether you're a quasi-governmental entity. This is something that is now very front of mind. The intensifying impact of climate change, though, does not only present physical risk. So I think we're often talking about life safety and, oh no, my business was destroyed, et cetera. But it goes beyond that. And this is really less talked about, and I think it's important. It includes everything from our entire financial system, private investments, companies, pension funds, et cetera. They're all at risk of extreme weather events. So it's not just about how do we build a dam to help protect against flooding. It's about how do we protect the entire sort of financial and governmental infrastructure around this as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because a failure to appropriately and adequately account for measures and measure these risks doesn't only affect us, as I said, in terms of life safety and property loss, but also potentially threatens the competitivity of the United States companies and markets, life savings and pension plans, as well as our financial institutions. So this is not something that we can just sniff away and say that it's not that important. And this map, this comes from NOAA. And they put this out every year, and it terrifies me. It should be like on my Halloween, front door. But basically, as of 2021, as of October 8th, right? So it's constantly changing the data. There have been 18 weather or climate events that have cost the United States over $1 billion. And 1 in 3 Americans have been directly affected by this. So this is not an ethereal threat that's out there that we need to worry about, maybe if it will or will not affect us. 1 in 3, whether you're living as a retiree in Florida and being impacted by hurricanes, or whether you're in California being affected by wildfires, or you're in Houston during the freeze and your power went out. These are real situations. And it seems to me that the more, maybe I'm getting old and disgruntled, but the more I watch the news, I'm like, this is only about weather events now. It seems that every week there's something happening. So the need to minimize this and to adapt to this, it has to be a priority, as I said, for every element of the economy. So in the United States, just to highlight some of these horrible things, wildfires have burned nearly 6 million acres of land. That's the equivalent of the total land mass of Massachusetts and Rhode Island combined this year alone. So that's how much is burned. So we've lost 2 states worth of fires. It's disabled our international supply chains. Those of you doing your Christmas shopping know that as well as I do. And after carving its destructive path through the Gulf of Mexico and stalling commodity exports to the world, Hurricane Ida took down the New York City subway system for hours, dumping 3.15 inches of rain. So it's across. These are swaths of weather events that are impacting us. At the same time, on the other side of the country, the Hoover Dam at Lake Mead reached its lowest level of water since it was built in 1931, causing the federal government to declare the first ever water shortage on the Colorado River. So these are widespread, disparate, different kinds of things that are happening. So it's not just one thing. It's not protect ourselves against flooding. It's protecting ourselves against drought, wildfires, and other sorts of things. Since 1980, we've had over 308 weather and climate events that exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of this to the US economy has been over $2 trillion. And this is just to recover and get back to where we were. It's not to improve our infrastructure or to look to the future. So with that said, there's a clear and compelling case to be made for investing in resilient infrastructure, anything that can help protect us against the impact of these sorts of things, right? Whether it's drought, flooding, freezes, severe storms, winter storms, wildfires. We need to invest in that. And there's a really famously quoted study in 2018 by the National Institute of Building Sciences. And for every dollar spent on hazard mitigation, meaning preventative measures against these sort of climate risks, it yields about $6 in total benefits. So including property damage, loss of business, and health impact. So if I was investing in the stock market and I knew by putting in $1 today, I was going to get $6 in benefits tomorrow, I would do it in a heartbeat. But when it comes to public investment, we tend to balk. We don't tend to make these investments in a timely manner. And to the contrary, even though we know that disasters are going to disrupt power, communications, everything, life safety, death, we don't make these investments in a timely manner. To the contrary, the majority of our money goes into rebuilding after the effect. We have a saying in sort of the federal world that I live in, fix as fails, meaning there's not enough money to make preventative, timely, proactive investments. So we'll just wait for that asset to fail, and then we'll get money from Congress 100 times over to be able to replace it. That is the least efficient way of doing infrastructure. You want to take preventative measures, you want to protect, but moreover, in these cases, we're talking life safety. We're talking the putting of American citizens at risk of death if we don't make some of these investments. So the need for proactive investments at a range of scales are needed to mitigate these economic losses, protect life, all those sorts of things. The challenge is, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that we have a diversity of things that need to happen, of project types. You know, you're looking at different sort of infrastructure solutions for flooding versus wildfire, right? And so it's not just one thing, it's many things. And secondly, it's on differing scales, right? You can go to the very macro level as a property owner, the need to move, just as an example, your utility closet from the basement to the rooftop to prevent it against vulnerabilities of flooding, versus the need to do entire watershed, multi-state flood risk management projects that cost billions of dollars, right? So it's a whole swath of things. And when we get into different size projects and different jurisdictions, it tends to paralyze us as a country because our institutions and our lending institutions are not oriented in this manner. So this is sort of the context of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not just going to present the problems. There actually are some really good solutions, but I'm also going to talk about real-time changes that happened, you know, between yesterday when I put these slides together and this morning when I'm giving the presentation, because this is a very fluid area. But when I look at U.S. weather and climate disasters and the challenges that the United States has at the federal, state, local, and even the private level to address that, you know, I have to first focus on what are some of the challenges. And the first and foremost that I think most people are aware of that is very unique in this sector versus, or this area versus other sectors, are the market failures around this. And I'll talk a bit about that, but this is generally that, you know, we can't predict with perfect accuracy what timely interventions are going to do in terms of protection against events that we can't even at this point predict with accuracy that are coming, right? So we have a number of market failures that we need to work around and work through in order to be able to make timely and cost-effective investments. Secondly, and I think everyone understands this, there are a lot of competing priorities out there that are impacting the availability of funding, right? I mean, people need to rebuild roads in general. They don't have enough money for that, but then they also, on top of that, need to make timely investments in resilience infrastructure. There's only so many dollars in the bank. So how can resilience infrastructure compete for these sorts of things? Thirdly, as I mentioned before, we do not have a financial market framework around this. We have just recently started to gain a framework around things like environment, sustainability, and governance with ESG. But in terms of resilience, we're still at ground zero. There's nothing there. The federal government is moving in terms of trying to create a roadmap for this, but it is certainly a market failure right now that is impacting us. And probably most importantly, and this is what, you know, in my daily life when I'm not working with Steve in the GRN that I deal with, and that's advising public sector agencies on how to implement investments in resilience or public infrastructure in general. One of the challenges we have is the scaling and scoping of these investments. As I mentioned, it's not one kind of thing. It's not a road. and it's not a water system. It's many different micro projects that together collectively will create protection against whatever the climate event might be. And there's an institutional misalignment around this. It doesn't fall only in your Department of Transportation. It doesn't fall only in your utility company. It doesn't fall only in a local community group. It is a cross-cutting solution. And I often say, you know, a levee is only as good as its weakest link. So if you don't have everybody participating in this, and we do have free rider arguments and those sorts of things, problems, it's not going to get built. And so the need for the scaling and scoping investments, we need to realign our institutions around this. And likewise, and this is very dear to my heart, is the need for project delivery frameworks that reflect these sorts of challenges. So it's not about just procuring somebody to build a seawall. It's about getting that seawall built in the timely and most cost-effective manner, and that's not happening in resilience infrastructure. We have trouble in all the sectors, but it's particularly acute when it comes to this, and I'll give some examples of that here. So I'll talk about the first, which are the market failures, which are deterring investment. And a lot of this, to my point earlier, derives from imperfect data. To this day, there's no easy way to estimate the extent and the probability of future damage due to, you know, extreme climate events. You can't say with certainty, even if you get, you know, your hurricane models, where they're going to hit, what the impacts are going to be, et cetera. So therefore, making an investment to protect your community against that, it's a hard sell, right? Because I don't know what the actual benefits deriving from this will be on a precise basis. And when this happens, most of our public dollars, whether you know this or not, are allocated on the basis of some sort of formulation of a benefit cost ratio. So here are the benefits, here's the cost, here's how we're going to prioritize our investments. But when you have imperfect data, it makes it much harder case to make these investments. So this has been a problem that I don't think is easily remedied. You know, people say, well, go to the insurance sector. They have actuarial people that come up with sort of a risk assessment and trying to quantify the damages. But even they are having trouble, without a doubt, in terms of these extreme weather conditions, which is evidenced by the fact that a lot of them, when they get hit by these sorts of events, are having trouble even figuring out how to pay out, how much to pay out, and what those sorts of things are. So we do have a fundamental informational risk or informational sort of deficit in terms of how to do that. Climate-related financial risks are likely highly unrecognized. So as I mentioned before, when you look at things like pension funds that are investing in whether it's infrastructure assets or even public geo bonds, what are the implications? What are the risks associated with the major climate investments? So if you're an investment in the metro, the MTA in New York City, the New York Transit Authority, after Hurricane Ida, as I mentioned, you know, they went offline. There were all kinds of issues. They have insurance. They have some insurance that help them recover more quickly than most others would, but it can definitely impact your returns. It can impact, you know, basically your investments of other people's money. And so we have a systematic financial risk associated with this, but nobody's ever been able to quantify it, right? We don't have at this point sort of the rating agencies providing information on things like resilience risk and those sorts of things. So there are a lot of risks that are unrecognized. We definitely have in this particular area, probably more acutely than in others, free rider and broad beneficiaries problems. So the problem we have is who pays for this, right? So often when the public sector makes investments in seawalls or protection, think Miami, Brickell Avenue, who's the immediate beneficiary are those developers that are able to put in high-level condos. Now, are they paying for this themselves through developer fees or general obligation bonds or general taxes being used? This has been a real problem because there's often a sense that when you make these investments, it's to favor few, so you get a little bit of public pushback. On the flip side of this is our vulnerable communities, right? So in this particular case, those who are most at risk are the poorer and the poorer and rural communities, the ones that can't afford to pay these sorts of things. So when we get these massive projects that are actually led and paid for by private sector redevelopers and those sorts of things, could they actually be putting some of our most vulnerable communities at risk? And this goes back into the free rider and the broader beneficiary problem. As I mentioned before, our insurance markets and property markets are not really fully reflective of these climate risks. Also important to keep in mind is that, there's a lot of talk out there, well, the insurance companies could influence the investment in infrastructure by just increasing premiums here and there, and people would be incentivized to make investments if that would offset. Now, forget about the fact that we don't have perfect information, so the amount of that investment we couldn't be too clear on. But think about it in these terms. The majority of our public infrastructure is owned and operated by the public sector, so roads and water systems and those sorts of things. And the vast majority of our public assets are not insured by third parties. It's self-insurance. So think about it, if the federal government gets hit by a hurricane, they don't go to AIG to get an insurance payment. It's a self-insured. And to be quite frank, the federal government is the insurer of last resort. If there's an incident in New Orleans, it's FEMA money that comes in after the fact to help rebuild. It's not the insurance money itself. Now, FEMA may go after the insurance companies for some reimbursement, and you may at a very small level get some money, but rest assured that your roads and your bridges and everything, the levees that are being rebuilt with public money. And that flows down to the state and local governments. Most state and local governments do not hold insurance policies against their public buildings, against the road networks, et cetera. And because of this, the insurance industry can't really increase rates. Because of this, there might be an imperfect market assessment of how much risk we have that would help you drive the investment into overcoming or mitigating some of that risk. Another point that I do want to point out in this, and I'll talk more about this at the end, is that, one, lack of uniform regulatory framework. You can go to two towns that are right next to each other that are in the same watershed, meaning that when it floods both of them. For political reasons or even regulatory reasons, you may have two very different approaches to the risk assessment of whether or not the flood is going to come or not going to come, and B, what needs to be done. You might have different building codes. You might have different even different political tilts. Some people might say, we're not going to get involved in climate resilience, and the others might be embracing it as sort of a public good and something that they want to do. This is leading to a lot of problems because, as I said before, these solutions cannot be parsed together and piecemeal. They're only as good as the totality of the infrastructure that is being used to protect against that. So if you have one town in the middle of 5 towns that decides for political reasons or financial reasons, it doesn't want to put in a levee, then the entire levee system doesn't work. All the water is going to be flooding. In fact, they're going to put themselves at more risk. So we need a cross-jurisdictional approach to this that is more uniform. And that's very hard in the United States, where we have 50 different states and thousands of different micro-jurisdictions, each with their own rules and regulations. And finally, to the same point, this multi-sector and multi-jurisdictional issue is really affecting the ability to build to scale needed projects. So even think Boston, where Steve and the GRI are sitting, right? So they have a very robust climate plan in place that cuts across multiple jurisdictions and all sorts of things, multiple East Boston, you've got Cambridge, and they each have very specifically aligned plans for what needs to be done. But if one sector or one subsector, one of these areas is built out, all that's going to do is move the water to another area, right? Water doesn't care about your politics. It's going to go to the lowest level of resistance. So if East Boston can put up flood walls and levees, and another part of the floodplain can't, then all that means is that that's going to be affected more acutely. And what we often find in that case, as I mentioned before, is that those tend to be the more vulnerable and the poorer community. So you have to take sort of a watershed, more holistic approach to these sorts of things, which are complicated by the multiple jurisdictions. So as a result of all of this, it's been harder to find sort of the win-win opportunity. So I often think of energy efficiency. That was not hard to convince people to do, because you could say, look, make these investments today and your utility bill is going to be lower. Makes sense, right? And I can even calculate how much lower. These market failures that we have when it comes to resilience are impeding that same sort of easy calculation, right? And it's just making it a little bit harder for people to make the case for these investments. And at the end of the day, when the budgets are being done, these are some of the projects that are being left off because they're not making the same strong and compelling cases as perhaps some other sorts of investments. So these are some of the issues that we need to address. But on top of that, we have the funding issue. And I just mentioned this. for those who know me, I harp on this all the time. It's sort of, why I don't get invited to a lot of dinner parties anymore, because I just talk about this. But in the United States, we need about $7.7 trillion in investment in our infrastructure, regardless of climate change and climate resilience project. 7.7 trillion by 2030, just to keep pace with GDP. This means just to tread water. If we don't do this, we're going to have, longer traffic jams, we're going to have worse airports, et cetera. And so we're constantly trying to invest in our infrastructure across all the sectors. Now, we just got a big boost in that regard from the new bipartisan infrastructure bill, but that's 1.2 trillion over 8 years. So as you can see, that is not even the totality of what need, by any stretch of the imagination, the totality of what we need to maintain our infrastructure. So add to that the need to start in a sort of a different approach to building resilience infrastructure, to building our infrastructure, not only to replace and sort of repair what we have, but we need to build it now to better standards so that we can protect ourselves and the future generations against these increasingly adverse climate events. So that's not even contemplated within the 7.7 trillion. So once you start to think about the price tag on this, 10, 12, 15 trillion dollars that's going to be needed to invest in our infrastructure, not only to repair and replace, but also to prepare it for future climate risk, you start to understand the magnitude of the problem. And state and local governments, quite frankly, across the nation are at their debt limits, right? They don't have a lot of cash just laying around to do fun things with. So consequently, every single project that you and I might on this call or this webinar might think is a priority, like, why wouldn't you invest in like climate resilience infrastructure? Because it needs to compete with public schools, it needs to compete with hazardous waste removal, it needs to, and so what happens is it falls into the general competition that exists out there. On top of that, as I also mentioned, we have some key funding issues: fairness and equity and resilience finance. As I mentioned, a lot of the investment, or a lot of the negative impact of climate events is disproportionately impacting our poorer communities, right? They're the ones that can't put in levees, they can't put in flood walls, they might be living in an area where they can't easily relocate because of rising weather. And this is something that needs to be taken into account also at the time of public budgets and other things. It also impacts things, as I mentioned. You may say, well, I can just rebuild everything by requiring developers, when they're going to redevelop an area like East Boston, which is in the process of a massive redevelopment, anytime in the permit application, I'll require them to put in a levee. Well, that's fine for communities that are gentrifying and that are modernizing, right? But there's still a lot of places where that's not happening, and you can't leave those communities completely exposed to the brunt of our climate impacts. So that's a big issue. The cost sharing is another one, narrow versus broad. And I mentioned this before. This is, single property owners may benefit. They could actually be the ones that are putting in these investments, but you have to also look that they're broader beneficiaries, as I mentioned before. It might not only be the people living on the waterfront, but people living in Miami, for instance. It's not just about those that are on the waterfront. It's about the fact that the sea is rising and raising the water tables in the aquifer and pushing out sanitation and those sorts of things. So you have to look at who are the beneficiaries of these projects, and they may be a little bit more broader. And from a tax base, should you take a tax approach to only putting the burden on those who are immediately impacted, or should we try to spread this out on a broader level across the entire community that will benefit from this as well? And that's led to a lot of confusion. You do have some flood districts that are putting in tax incremental financing and special taxes, but mostly to date, most of the funding for this is either coming through general user fees or general obligation bonds, meaning general taxation. So there's still kind of, I think, a question out there about how best to create a cash flow that can help to fund some of this. Affordability issues are also a key element, as is life cycle maintenance. There's a lot of talk right now about the infrastructure bill. Look, we've got 50 billion, which I'll talk about in a second, for resilience projects. That's to put them in the ground Once they're in the ground, they have to be maintained. So I think you have to also think about, this is not just a one and out. This is, we have to maintain these assets, because a dam, a levee, whatever the case might be, if it breaks, we're going to need to maintain it. And so that's an issue, but affordability as well. So a lot of people have talked about putting in user fees on your utility bills. Let's put in, 20-cent tax on everybody's monthly water bill, so that people can, fund, or the water company can fund some resilience projects. And while that sounds like a good idea, you have to keep in mind that right now, almost 40% of American households are up at the affordability threshold for water, meaning that as we invest in new infrastructure and we take the lead out of our water, it's estimated that 40% of our families are not going to be able to afford water in accordance with EPA affordability thresholds, meaning it's costing them 20% of their monthly income to get water, right? So adding fees works in some communities, particularly wealthier communities, but it's not necessarily a viable solution for all communities. So I think that's another thing that needs to be sort of gut checked. And, I think some of the money that's out there for resilience projects definitely needs to be focused on some of the poorer and more at-risk communities that can't afford some of these kind of obvious solutions, like increasing your tax rates or increasing your utility bills. With regard to private financing as well, so the types of funding that we're generally seeing, as I mentioned, are taxes. Just general taxes are being used. These are public goods, these investments, so generally tax receipts are used for that. Fees, as I mentioned, like airport fees and water fees, where they're directing some of that money to go into to specific projects, but also private investment, right? And I think that a lot of people are looking for the private sector to somehow come in and maybe infuse a lot of money. And I think that there are some areas where that's going to happen, particularly on the parcel level, or even sometimes on a district level. So when you're looking at a building developer, they're going to probably be willing, as they are with affordable housing, to set aside some money for investment in flood resilience or fire resilience, or whatever the case might be. But that's kind of the exception, not the rule. There is very little in terms of payback opportunity for a lot of these projects, right? So these are public good projects. And so you build a flood wall, you can't really monetize that. You're not going to be charging tolls like you could on a road, and you're not going to be charging like airport facility fees as you might at an airport. And so the private finance will be available. People will be willing to come in and to finance, but they still need to be repaid. So the private sector is unlikely to be the savior of our resilience financing, right? Because there are very few monetization impacts on that. They may be able to deliver it in a timely or more cost-effective manner, but ultimately, because these are like roads and these are like bridges and other things, the majority of this will be paid back through some sort of public funding, because it's hard to monetize the benefits of this specifically. That said, we are seeing some leveraging of market incentives, and I'll talk about that in one second. I do want to talk briefly, and I could talk about all of this for hours and hours, as you can probably tell. I do want to mention what's going on with the infrastructure bill, which has now been passed by both houses and just awaiting President Biden's signature. This comes sort of in addition to other things that have been happening over the years. So I was mentioning before this call that, 5 years ago, I was reading through some infrastructure bills at the federal level, and the word resilience was mentioned like maybe 5 times. That was it. In the most recent, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed by both houses of Congress, resilience is mentioned over 200 times. It includes $50 billion in new resilience funding. And it's everything from PROTECT, which is promoting resilient operations for transformative, efficient, and cost-saving transportation. So these are transportation grants at $8.7 billion. You've got BRIC, which is Building Resilience in Communities programs. That's grant funding for communities. You've got FEMA mitigation. You've got the STORM Act, which was created just recently. It's a revolving loan program to provide for funding for hazardous projects. Lots for our good friends at the Corps of Engineers and FEMA and NOAA for flood resilience measures, so billions of dollars there. They're putting in a new resilience and adaptation center of excellence, clean water resilience and sustainability there's a lot there, but it's in a lot of smaller pieces. And to Steve's point at the beginning, this is going to require communities to get really familiar with what's in the budget, and B, how they're going to make their case for getting that money, right? But that's in addition to things that already existed. So we already had some money for resilience through our state revolving funds, our clean water fund, our drinking water fund. I do want to call out something that has gotten very little attention, but is near and dear to my heart, is the Corps of Engineers also is rolling out its water infrastructure financing program for civil work. So this was approved in 2014, and it's taken till now for them to sort of move it out. If you're familiar with WIFIA or TIFIA, which are some of our federal credit programs that are used for transportation and water, this is very similar. Oddly, curiously, and something that I don't necessarily agree with, the legislation itself was very broad-based, that the Corps would use this for really flood risk management projects writ large. For some reason, I think OMB has limited the application of this only to dam safety and dam improvements, which it's not bad. So to be eligible for this, you need to be on the national inventory of dams. We have about 91,000 dams that are listed on that, and they're state and locally owned or privately owned. 65% are actually privately owned dams, which is unique in our public infrastructure world to have so much private sector involvement on dams. But something like 20% of these are considered high hazard, meaning that they need massive investments, and their failure. Think of the Oroville Dam that imploded not too long ago. Imagine that happening to 20% of the dams across our country when you have 91,000 dams. It's a very serious issue. And even though a lot of the needs have been flagged, there's been very little money available for it. So for me, the core infrastructure financing program is going to be incredibly impactful in terms of flood safety, and this is across all communities from California down to Florida. But I think that what's mind-boggling is that this does not apply to things like levees. And again, you'll have to write your Congress people or OMB and find out why that is. But it seems to me that in a world where we desperately need investment in these sorts of things, to limit it only to dams and not to think more broadly about flood risk management projects is a little bit befuddling, but who am I to interpret Washington to the rest of you? That's beyond my capabilities. So those are some of the funding issues. In terms of the financial market framework, I talked a little bit about this, so I'll be a little bit briefer on this. As I mentioned, we do not in the United States or even on the global level have a framework around channeling private investment into these sorts of projects, or even into companies that are focusing on making these improvements. So there's a need still for more consistent regulation. And as I said, we've seen it already within like green bonds and sort of environmentally focused things, but we have not yet gone in this direction in terms of the financial markets. So there's going to be a need for the rating agencies and even the SEC to incorporate climate-related financial risk into underwriting. Obviously, nobody is going to finance large-scale projects if they're in a floodplain. That's already flagged. But to make this a little bit more broadly, we need to have better data on this, and we need to have those sorts of things to protect it. This will likewise probably encourage pension funds and others to start focusing on more resilient infrastructure investments, right? Because you want to at least be able to claim to the public who you're representing that you're taking into account, catastrophic events when you're making your investment. You don't want to invest in something that could potentially be a loss, 100% loss due to climate issues. We also don't have in the financial sector really many resilience-focused financial instruments. We're all seeing the green bond, which quite frankly can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. We've got all kinds of great products out there. In the resilience world, it's still quite limited, in part because some of the market failures. The CAT bond is possibly the exception. It's a catastrophe bond, which is basically a kind of hybrid insurance instrument and bond, but the investors who buy CAT bonds receive interest payments. The beauty of the CAT bond so it was used as an example by the MTA, New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, and it protected them against it. Well, they got it after Sandy, but it's protected them on a number of instances. Usually with insurance, what happens is when an event strikes, the insurance adjusters have to go out and they have to measure the cost and so what are the real damages, and they pay out. Even when the federal government is the insurer of last resort, it took Congress 90 days after Hurricane Ida, I believe, or maybe it was Sandy, to come up with a rescue package. Those 90 days are critically important. Cat bonds, their benefit is that they pay out immediately once a certain trigger event hits. So they don't need to do the assessment, and that's a very good thing to hold. So that's a good instrument. There's talk still of resilience bonds, which have not rolled out well, writ large just yet, but maybe they will come into effect in the future. But to date, there are relatively few resilience specific investment products out there. So there's a need as well to sort of, I think, fortify the financial sector in that regard. I do want to point out, for those who don't know, there was recently an executive order on climate-related financial risk and a corresponding roadmap to build a climate resilient economy, which came out in October of 2021. It's kind of not been focused on because of all the talk around infrastructure, but its purpose is to create a climate risk framework for addressing financial risk, and really interesting things. I recommend that you read this. So it incorporates climate-related financial risk into federal financial management in general, but is also using federal procurement, the FAR, to address climate-related risks, requiring certain FAR provisions that would focus any federal money on more climate safety and climate protection. Also, a way of protecting life savings and pensions from climate-related risk by imposing new regulations in terms of investment, and incorporating climate-related financial risk into federal lending and underwriting. Again, if you're going to get a WIFIA or a TIFIA loan, you better make sure that you're investing in resilient infrastructure and investing in flood protection measures or fire protection measures, et cetera. So it's a really interesting framework. There's still a lot of work that needs to go into it, to implementing it, but it's certainly a good starting point to addressing what I had highlighted as a financial market framework. And finally, before I'll open it up to questions, because as I said, I could talk for hours, I think is beyond the financial market framework is a delivery framework. And I guess I should have retitled this slide a little bit differently. And many people don't know this, but 9 out of 10 mega projects, which are projects that are over $1 billion across the globe, overrun their budget, are delayed, and don't deliver the expected benefits that were actually calculated to justify the investment. Now, we're all witnesses of this. We are everywhere. So you've got like road projects that have been going on your entire lifetime, and you're wondering, are they ever going to finish? We have horror stories of the federal government or state and local governments having a 3,000% cost overrun, and instead of a project being done in 5 years, it takes 50, right? So this isn't new to us. But just look at that data, 90%. That means 9 out of 10 projects will go over budget, not deliver their benefits, and will take longer than needed to give you your public benefits. So while funding and financing are a challenge to resilience infrastructures, I think this is perhaps the largest challenge, because this is A, the part that nobody's talking about, and B, the part that is probably going to most impact life safety and our ability to actually accrue benefits from this. So I like to refer to what's happening right now as a piecemeal, partial, and protracted implementation delivery approach. So what we're doing is budgets are limited, so people will get a little bit of money and they're going to invest it in maybe one piece of a flood wall. Well, that's not going to protect you from a flood. It makes you feel good about yourself because you've invested something, but there's really no public benefit in that until you've done the entire project. So this piecemeal approach is almost a head fake to the public. Hey, yeah, we're investing in resilience, but they're not investing in things that actually will impact you or protect your property or your life, right? And so this partial and protracted implementation is a real problem. And complicating that as well is the institutional framework. And I mentioned this before. The challenge that we have is that none of these projects are limited to one institution. If we look at the Boston, just because Steve's in Boston, I'm harping on Boston, but Boston has its climate 2024 or 2020, whatever it was, plan. And it's very robust, and it's a great planning document, and it covers, every single district and everything that needs to go in, whether it's at the airport, whether it's in the port, whether it's on individual property levels. But the effect, the benefits of that accrue really when everything has been done. You've got permeable pavements in parks, you've got, flood walls, et cetera. And that's where the brunt of the public benefits begin. But if you're going to piecemeal that together, and each district is going to be looking at how to finance it, and some it's going to take 10 years, and others it's going to take 40 years because they don't have the funding or they don't have the political ability to get these things funded. This is a real problem. This is a real problem because you have to take a more holistic approach to this. And our institutions, as I said, what they're doing at the airport is not going to be necessarily cleared in advance with what, an individual property owner is doing elsewhere, right? So you need an institutional structure that can shepherd through these cross-sector, cross-institutional elements. We have some attempt at that, right? And so we've seen some resilience, we've seen some flood joint JPAs, joint power authorities. We've seen some resilience officers, but they don't have the authority yet to really oversee this and to get things done. And it's a problem because we're so set in our ways here in the US in terms of how we've structured our organizations that even putting in a resilience officer with no authority has taken a decade, right? But to actually have somebody in the budget office who is looking at these sort of integration issues in terms of resilience projects and helping make decisions in terms of prioritizing investment, we're still a long ways away from that thus far. And the scaling and scoping problems, as I said, these projects in general are a combination of 100 different small, tiny little things, right? So as I said, it could be permeable pavements to limit the amount of water runoff, or it could be large scale mitigation projects, ecosystem restoration, or it could be flood walls, or it could be a combination of all those things that are needed to have the impact. But what often happens is they get divided into tiny little pieces. And so, as I said, you can piecemeal it together. You got $50,000, or a community raises $50,000, and they can put in permeable pavements, but that's not really going to scratch the itch in terms of what needs to be done to address some of the climate issues. As I said before as well, the other thing that really nobody is talking about yet is if we can get these things in the ground, how are we taking care of them, right? So if private property owners are forced to put in a flood wall or a levee on their property, what tools do we have to ensure that they maintain that as well, right? So it's not just today. Things are going to get only worse, not better. What are the enforcement mechanisms that exist out there to ensure that even privately placed infrastructure is maintained if it has a public purpose, right? So like a levee would be protecting not only that property, but also adjacent properties and likely populations around that private property. So these are important things that need to be considered. And I think the frustration that exists with many people working in this sector is like, look, there's been a lot of good planning documents done, but how do you get those into the ground? How do we go from concept to reality in light of many of these challenges, right? And one way that gives me a little bit of optimism, and this speaks as well to sort of the role of the private sector. And look, this is all hands on deck. I'm not saying it has to be private sector or it can only be public sector. It needs to be everybody. And I think that there's no room and no time for sort of this philosophical debate about, government, essentially governmental, and those sort. We need to do whatever possible to get projects done. So one of the ways that I have been sort of pushing is to look at community-based public-private partnerships as a way of delivering some of this. For those of you not familiar, CBP3, community-based public-private partnership, is a model that was rolled out by the EPA a decade ago for stormwater management. So a lot of local towns and local jurisdictions were under consent decrees with EPA to put in improvements for stormwater. And again, tiny little projects, planting more trees, putting in permeable pavement. So a lot of like micro projects that need to get done. But A, there was no real like availability of upfront funding for that. And B, there were such small projects and such a diversity of areas that it paralyzed a lot of institutions in terms of how to do it. So they turned to the private sector. And under the CBP3 model, you bundle a whole bunch of these projects together. It doesn't matter if it falls in, you know, the jurisdiction of the water company or the airport operator or even private property owners. You bundle them together, allow the private partner to go out and get the financing for this, deliver these things, and you only begin to pay pay the private partner back after they hit certain milestones. So after they deliver certain types of infrastructure. That way you're paying for the benefits of it instead of paying in advance of the benefits. But we've seen it work really well. You still have to come up with a funding mechanism, meaning a way to repay the private operator. And so in these cases, it's usually through stormwater fees and those sorts of things when it's under the CBP3 for stormwater. But going forward, it might be a better way of particularly in communities that have a multitude of projects cross-cutting a multitude of institutions, maybe a good way to move forward. It also allows them to get full upfront funding through bond issuances, the private sector. So it's off the public sector's balance sheet, but then they only get repaid upon completion. So that's one example. Another example that I love to highlight is the increasing use of public-private partnerships, different than the community-based P3, but public-private partnerships in general to deliver massive and critically important climate resilience projects. So one that I had the pleasure of working on early with the Corps of Engineers is the first in the United States Fargo-Moorhead diversion project, which is up in North Dakota and Minnesota. And it's a $2.75 billion project in total that is being done through a public-private partnership. And so in this case, the private entity is coming in, they're bringing in their own design and construction capabilities. They'll be privately financing this as well as operating, maintaining it over a 50-year period. And so they're building in a diversion channel, so a big ditch, as well as some levees and those sorts of things to protect this area that historically gets flooded once a year. When they have a 500-year flood, you know, the economic damage is massive. So this project will stave that off. And by using a public-private partnership, you know, this is a way for the community to get this done in a timelier manner. We estimate it would have taken upwards of 16 to 30 years to get the project done using traditional delivery methods. So this is a way of accelerating the benefits. And the same is happening now as well for a lot of mitigation projects. So LA, Denver, others are looking at public-private partnerships for things like ecosystem restoration projects, et cetera. Not because they want the project, the private sector necessarily, it's because this is a way that they can get the full funding up front and deliver it in a timelier, more cost-effective manner, lowering the cost and getting the benefits more quickly than if they did it in the traditional way. So there is hope out there, I want to say, in terms of getting through some of these challenges, but these challenges are unique to resilience. As I said, you know, we've seen in other sectors and other issues like environmental sustainability and those sorts of things, easier ways of addressing them, but this is what has really been stymieing in many respects the needed investment in resilience. You know, I think we should feel pretty good about 50 billion and 45 billion in climate resilience and another 5 billion in cyber resilience in the new infrastructure bill. It's not enough, but it's a great start. But again, it's not just money. You've got to think about how you're going to deliver that infrastructure in the timeliest and most cost-effective manner. There's not enough money to go around for everything, so you got to figure out ways to make that money work in the most effective way possible. And I think there are some models out there. And hopefully we'll be developing new models as we go. But I'll pause there because I've been rambling now. Probably everyone is hung up because I can't see your faces. But and I'll hand it back to you, Steve, in case you have any questions or would like to disinvite me from future events.
Hey, Jill, that was great. What a tour de force, and everybody's still here. So
Awesome.
You commanded the audience. So thanks so much for that. I think we can go. Can we drop the slides and put people on screen if we can? I know we're down to just a few minutes. Let me get us started with, you know, I think you really just gave us a tour de force about the challenges and the urgency for dealing with this challenge. I raised at the outset this issue of essentially planning capacity. Now that all this funds are going to be made available, I worry that we've been in such an idle period of time for so long, and this is especially true in the Northeast region, but other parts of the Rust Belt, where they just haven't been growing. So there's just not a lot of competent or deep bench of planners who can suddenly put together, complex packages that address the needs that you just laid out here. And as far as I can tell, there's really not much funding for that, right? To sort of help with particularly disadvantaged communities be able to, go after some of these resources. Florida will do fine, Texas will do fine, California will do fine because they've been at this game and their growth areas. But I worry about areas where perhaps the need is greatest. Is there any reason to be hopeful on that score that you see out there?
I think you're right. I think that the problem with a lot of money coming into the system is there are a couple of problems, right? Those who are better off, I guess it was Benjamin Franklin said a bank's role is to give money to the people who least need it. That's often what happens when the federal government pours a lot of cash in that. Those who are better prepared and they've been thinking about this and they've had money to do the studies will obviously be better prepared to make those applications. That said, I do think there is some money, whether it is the FEMA Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and some others, they do have planning elements in there. That said, the federal government would be ill-advised to simply hand out money to people without a plan, right? so there's going to have to be a little bit of both of that. But obviously, to make the case, when you do a grant application or a loan application, you're going to have to show that the projects you're doing have been analyzed and their impact has been analyzed, because the benefits that would be accruing are going to be looked at very closely. If you haven't done those studies, then I think, yeah, you definitely want to get into some of there's a Resilience and Adaptation Center of Excellence, and hopefully that will come with enough money so that some of the poor communities and less advantaged communities can hire people to do those studies up front. But the good news is that most of this funding comes over 8 years. So those who have not done this can get cracking in the hopes that they will be able to achieve money once they have sort of a context for this a little bit more. But I think this administration in particular, outside of what we saw in terms of resilience, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure equity. And I think that, looking at some of those provisions as well, where they do talk about the need to invest back in those communities. And there are a number of programs outside of resilience itself that are lending themselves to that. And I think that might be a good place for people to start as well.
Great. As Grant Howard put something in the chat here about a challenge nationwide, but one that's probably New England specializes on, which is we love our postage stamp size community. and you raise this issue like just coordination across the metro Boston area. But this challenge of working across multi-jurisdictions when infrastructure and systems sprawl across them, effective solutions like to watershed issues and other stuff require this depth of collaboration. Are there some best practices that you can point to about how, some parts of the country or somebody who is tackling this well to get the kind of comprehensive approach that's going to be needed?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a trend towards JPAs, joint power authorities, that are being created. So flood mitigation districts are popping up left and right? And so I think that there is a need for people to take a different approach, right? So wildfires and hurricanes and floods are not going to limit themselves to your jurisdiction. So what you do need to do is work with your neighbors in terms of, and that requires sort of a data-driven approach. So you can scientifically figure out, okay, these are the most vulnerable communities to wildfires or to other sorts of things. But look, in the United States, we've done this for years through JPAs, joint power authorities, and those sorts of things. It's just simply, it hasn't been done as much for resilience because this is sort of something that's just hitting us over the head for the first time. So I think there are models out there. We've also seen models, with, as I mentioned, in North Dakota, so when they did the Fargo-Moorhead plan program, it's done through a JPA. So you have Minnesota, you have Fargo, you have the state of North Dakota. They created a new entity, which is the Joint Powers Authority, collectively, they issued like tax incremental financing, assessments, those sorts of things to raise money for this. The public was very much in favor as long as they knew they were getting the benefits that they were paying for, right? They were not going to just pay into the black hole of a large governmental entity that would never deliver anything. So I think there are a lot of examples out there, but it really is a matter of taking the initiative at the local level and saying, look, guys, I'll put up a flood wall. It's gonna flood you. If yours is higher, it's gonna flood me. Let's work together so that we don't have this sort of race to the bottom. But yeah, I think there are plenty of examples of where we've been able to do this.
Okay, great. And the politics of this are challenging as well. So another comment here was, FEMA's been a little slow rolling out flood maps because nobody wants the answer to their, here, the challenge of essentially producing facts that create, very uncomfortable economic outcomes. And of course, we're not just talking about well-to-do people on beachfront houses. We're talking also often vulnerable populations we did housing on floodplains because that was, available real estate. So just the issue of how do we get the facts out, the data, when there seems to be such political blowback around even something as basic as flood maps.
Yeah, outrage politics is not my thing, right? So everybody's screaming at the top of their lung. I mean, this is like really practical grassroots kinds of stuff. You're right. There's not perfect information out there, but between the FEMA flood maps, insurance assessments that are looking at these areas as well, there's a lot of information out there, right? But what you don't need is perfect information to be able to join forces to think about, let's start planning for the future. As I mentioned, there is a market failure, and that market failure is around data. The problem we have even now is if FEMA rolls out a new flood map, is that still going to be valid in 15 years? Do we need to keep on doing this? I'm working on a project right now in Oregon. It's a new wastewater treatment plant right on the Willamette River. And the issue that came up about what are we protecting against? Is it the 500-year flood? Is it the 100-year flood? Is it a 10-year flood? It really impacts what sort of mitigation measures need to be made. And we found at the end of the day, the financial community was the one that was saying, look, we're not going to invest in this project unless you protect against at least 100-year, right? And so there are many different sort of factors there, but I don't think we're ever going to have perfect data. And if we need perfect data, if that is going to be what will trigger people to work together, then we'll need to find another trigger because there's always going to be this market failure. We can't predict the future. I like to tell people I can and try to get them to give me $1 on street corners with my globe, but that's never really worked. So
well, certainly that's a great way to end it here because that's a charge, I think, for us in the research world here as well, to ultimately be able to forecast risk a bit better over the life cycle of prospective projects. And how do we think about risk? Now, it's always going to be a bounded reality that you can forecast, but there are ways, certainly, I think, to do a better job at anticipating what risk will look like and apply it daily against not just an asset, but to look at systems of systems. And so a lot to be done. This is, again, Jill, you've been great setting us up and understanding this all important ingredient. Again, a failure maybe of the academy is we're scrolling away in the proverbial ivory tower, coming up with best practices that nobody's ever actually gone to deploy and use. So that won't happen unless there's a connection to the market or government ultimately making those investments and understanding just the practical realities of why this is hard, is a essential starting point, to get us to a better place. So I appreciate everybody joining us here for this great hour. And thanks again, Jill, for just a really thoughtful, comprehensive presentation. And we'll appreciate and we'll look forward to hopefully another round of these coming up soon. Thank you, Kathleen, for all your choreography to make it happen. And we wish everybody a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.